Thank you.
Time's up. Mr. Davies.
Thank you. After on our fourth day of hearing, it's quite apparent that one of the major focuses of the testimony and the attention of committee members has been the impact of cannabis and cannabis legalization on young people, on youth. We've heard that Canadian youth are among the highest users of cannabis in the world, perhaps second highest. We've heard about the impacts on their health, their career prospects, the impact of legalization and criminalization on them. We've heard about brain development. We've heard that they apparently suffer from holding many myths and misinformation about cannabis. We've heard advice from people about how to effectively talk to young people about cannabis. We've heard different thoughts about their access to cannabis, whether they do or don't have easier access to cannabis than liquor. We've heard about their attitudes towards cannabis, yet we haven't heard from a single young person at this committee. Millions of Canadians use cannabis, have acknowledged it, use it today, have used it, and will continue to use it. The Parliamentary Budget Officer has estimated somewhere between 5 and 7 million Canadians will use cannabis once this legislation comes into force. And of course, millions of Canadians, I think, voted very clearly last election for a legalized approach to cannabis. We haven't heard from a single ordinary Canadian at this committee. Existing producers of cannabis, we have large established producers in this country right now who have been responsible for, I think, a decade of producing cannabis for the medicinal market, and dispensaries across this country, both in Ontario and British Columbia and maybe other provinces, who have been very actively serving the market, mainly while politicians have quietly ignored it and police forces. We haven't heard from a single producer of cannabis or dispensaries about their experience over a decade. And finally, this legislation that we've heard, it almost seems by design, is excluding edibles and concentrates and non-smokable cannabis products. Despite the health concerns, despite the obvious contradiction between the very purpose of this bill, which is to bring products out of the illicit market, to get rid of organized crime, to regulate these products for the health and safety of Canadians, and yet we haven't heard from a single producer of those products. So I think these are very, very important stakeholder groups, and I believe it's important to hear from them for the committee's full consideration of the most comprehensive evidence on this legislation. So therefore, colleagues, I wish to serve notice that I'm going to be moving the following motion to be debated at some point, convenient point later in the days, because I want to give my colleagues a chance to think about this. And the motion will read as follows: that pursuant to Standing Order 108-2, this committee meet for an additional 2 days for the purpose of the consideration of Bill C-45, an act respecting cannabis, and to amend the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, the Criminal Code, and other acts, and that the chair be empowered to coordinate the witnesses to a minimum of 32 witnesses, 8 per stakeholder group, the resources and scheduling necessary to complete this task in accordance with the following guidelines. 1. Witnesses are to represent the following stakeholder groups in 4 two-hour panel blocks per day. 1. Existing Canadian licensed producers and dispensaries. 2. Producers of edible cannabis products and other non-smokable forms of cannabis. 3. Ordinary Canadians who made a written submission to this committee regarding C-45. 4. Young Canadians, 15 to 24 years. Number 3, that witnesses for each panel block be allotted as follows: 2 Liberal, 1 Conservative, 1 NDP. 4, that witnesses be directed to prepare oral remarks for 10 minutes in length, and that the witnesses be invited to submit written statements prior to appearing. And 5, that the meetings be held prior to September 30, 2017. Colleagues, to conclude, the purpose of this is not to hold up these hearings. I'm mindful of the government's timeline, and it is September 14th. So I believe that we are meeting next week to hear from ministers. I want to give the clerk and the chair time to, and the parties time to put their witnesses in, but I think extending these hearings for another week and a half to hear from these important groups would be very, very important. I'm going to conclude by saying I've heard nothing but from 50-year-olds and 60-year-olds about how to talk to young people. I think it's time we heard from young people about their thoughts on this bill.
Just a thought on that. By the end of tomorrow, we'll have had, I think, 96 witnesses, and everybody's had a chance to submit witness lists. I'm not trying to downplay your thoughts on this, but I just want to make it clear that we will have had 96 witnesses as of tomorrow night. And we all had a chance to submit our lists at the opening. But I believe that the first chance you'll have to move that is on Tuesday, so we'll look forward to moving that.
Actually, Mr. Chair, I mean, I'm not going to get into debate now because I'm just serving notice, but I believe I can move this motion at any time. Mm-hmm. And but I don't want to interfere with the witnesses' testimony or colleagues, so I want to give my colleagues a chance to think about this. And I will say, though, that none of the categories that I mentioned were categories that were identified by the committee to hear from witnesses. And I believe the 96 witnesses, none of them will actually hear from these groups, and they certainly aren't topics that we were invited to submit witnesses on.
Anyway, well, your time is up, and I appreciate the notice. And that concludes Ms. Gladue.
Yes, just further to this motion, I wasn't involved in the actual submission of witnesses, so I apologize. But one thing that really concerns me is that all of the provinces that were invited to come don't want to come. And we haven't heard from any of them, and many of them have not fully developed their plans. And I would think that we would want to find out from them what's missing in the legislation. So I'm incredibly concerned about that and wouldn't mind adding that to the list of things that Mr. Davies is wanting. And the other thing is, although I see that you have a workplace safety panel, you don't really have any of the companies that might be in a dangerous industry wanting to implement some things. So that was also on my list of people I might want to hear from, as well as other countries. You know, Amsterdam, I used to visit there, and believe me, there's a lot of pot being smoked there. So I'd be interested to hear, you know, what they've done and perhaps something like that.
We invited almost all of the provinces, but only one agreed to come, which was a surprise to us.
Yeah, we can compel them, I think.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, all right, well, look, I want to conclude the meeting, and did you want to?
Just very, very quickly, I've done research, qualitative research, where I've interviewed individuals, as well as my PhD student, Riel Kapler, across Canada in terms of their use of medical cannabis and their access experiences. And I know it may not be 100% related, however, we do believe that many people that use non-medical cannabis are actually using it for medical purposes. And in talking to those Canadians, number one, they want to bring cannabis use out of the shadows and be able to talk about it with informed, non-judgmental health professionals. They're open to education about cannabis risks as well as their benefits. They want reasonable access to cannabis, both within their communities as well as through their health professionals. They want choice in cannabis in terms of the strains, the products, the mode of administration, and access points. They want their experiences related to cannabis and their beliefs to be respected, and they all recognize that stigma associated with cannabis use is incredibly damaging to open conversations about their substance use.
Okay, thanks very much, and I really very much want to thank the panelists today. We've had some excellent panelists all the way through this, but you've brought a lot of new information and perspective to us. We appreciate all the different envisions, ideas, and proposals that you brought to the table, and they will all be considered. So I want to thank you all very much again for participating.